The fluorescent lights of the all-night diner hummed a familiar, comforting tune as Camille wiped down the sticky vinyl booths, her wedding ring catching the harsh neon glow from the window. She should have been thinking about Ryan waiting at home in their cramped apartment. His hands blistered from the warehouse, but her fingers lingered too long on the burner phone tucked deep in her apron pocket, waiting for a text that had nothing to do with her marriage. Some secrets are too heavy for cheap linoleum and stale coffee to hide forever, and the moment the truth finally slipped out, it wasn't an explosion that followed, but a deafening, terrifying silence. If stories of quiet betrayals, shattered trust, and the heavy price of starting over resonate with your soul, stay here with me. There are still many locked doors to open in this Rust Belt town, and if you want to see what happens when the dust settles, don't leave the channel. The smell of old fry grease and strong bleach was permanently embedded in Camille Beaumont's skin. At 2:45 in the morning, the diner was a purgatory of fluorescent light and humming refrigerators. She stood behind the counter, a rag in her hand, staring blankly at the slow rotation of the pie display. The late-night crowd had thinned down to a few exhausted truckers and insomniac college students, leaving Camille alone with the ticking of the wall clock and the heavy, suffocating weight of her own life. Her apron pocket vibrated. A single short buzz. Camille's breath hitched. She glanced around the diner. Nancy, the line cook, was out back smoking, and the nearest customer was 3 booths away, snoring softly over a half-eaten plate of hash browns. With trembling fingers, she pulled out the cheap prepaid phone she kept strictly turned off during the day. Room 214, Starlight Motel. Tomorrow at 3 p.m. Don't be late. The text was from James. No hello, no how is your shift. Just a command disguised as an invitation. James Smith, the regional supervisor who signed her paychecks and controlled her schedule, also controlled the sudden, violent beating of her heart. He was polished leather shoes and expensive cologne in a world of scuffed work boots and engine oil. Camille typed back a single word, yes. She shoved the phone back into her pocket, feeling a sickening mixture of guilt and electric anticipation. She told herself, as she always did, that it was just a temporary escape, a way to feel seen, a way to feel like she wasn't just a tired woman aging under the harsh lights of a highway diner. When her shift finally ended at 6 a.m., the Pennsylvania sky was a bruised, industrial gray. Camille drove her sputtering Honda Civic through the quiet streets, the heater barely fighting the morning chill. She parked outside the bleak, brick apartment building she shared with Ryan. Turning the key in the lock, she stepped inside as quietly as possible. The apartment smelled of cheap coffee and muscle rub. Ryan Mitchell was asleep on the faded brown sofa. He hadn't even made it to the bedroom. He was still wearing his heavy canvas work pants, his steel-toed boots resting on the floor. One of his large, calloused hands hung off the edge of the cushions, the knuckles bruised and scraped from unloading wooden pallets and heavy machinery parts at the freight depot for 10 hours straight. Camille stood in the doorway of the living room, staring at the steady rise and fall of her husband's chest. Ryan was a good man, a quiet, sturdy man who handed over his paycheck every Friday and spent his Sundays fixing the leaky pipes beneath their sink because they couldn't afford a plumber. He never complained about the overtime, never complained about the lack of vacations, never complained about her, and that, strangely, was what suffocated her the most. His unconditional, unquestioning goodness made her own restlessness feel monstrous. She walked over and gently draped a fleece blanket over his broad shoulders. As she did, his brow furrowed in his sleep, and he let out a low, exhausted sigh. His silver wedding band caught the pale morning light filtering through the cheap blinds. Camille's hand instinctively brushed her apron pocket, where the burner phone rested like a warm coal against her hip. She swallowed hard, the taste of guilt thick in the back of her throat. She looked at the man breaking his back to build a life for them, knowing perfectly well that tomorrow afternoon she was going to tear it all down. She turned away, walking silently into the bathroom, closing the door on the man she was about to destroy. The hydraulic hum of the tow truck's winch still vibrated deep in Kevin Walsh's forearms as he steered the heavy flatbed off Interstate 76. It was just past 3 in the morning. He had spent the last 2 hours on the shoulder of a frozen highway, hauling a wrecked sedan out of a ditch while sleet bit at his neck. His knuckles were raw, stained with grease and road salt that no amount of scrubbing could fully remove. All he wanted was a large black coffee, burnt and bitter enough to keep him awake for the 3-mile drive back to his cramped apartment above the auto shop. He pulled into the parking lot of the diner, the neon sign buzzing a dull, flickering red against the heavy Pennsylvania sky. Given the size of the flatbed, Kevin avoided the front spaces, circling the building to park near the rear loading dock by the dumpsters. The back lot was usually empty save for a few battered employee vehicles. Tonight, however, a sleek, late-model BMW was idling in the shadows, its headlights off, the smooth hum of its engine distinctly out of place among the rusted sedans and crumbling asphalt. Kevin threw his truck into park, the air brakes hissing loudly in the quiet night. He grabbed his thermos from the passenger seat, preparing to walk around to the front entrance, when movement near the heavy metal exit door caught his eye. He froze. The shadows beneath the single, flickering security light shifted. It was Camille. She was still wearing her pastel diner uniform, her apron discarded over one arm. But it wasn't her presence at the back door that made Kevin's stomach plummet. It was the way she was standing. She was pressed against the brick wall, the man from the BMW leaning into her space. He was wearing a tailored wool overcoat, his hands resting possessively on her waist. Kevin's breath hitched, turning to white mist in the freezing air. He remained perfectly still in the elevated cab of his truck, hidden by the darkness and the dirty windshield. He watched, paralyzed, as Camille tilted her head back, allowing the man to kiss her neck. There was no hesitation in her posture, no resistance. It was an embrace of practiced familiarity, a quiet, desperate intimacy that belonged behind closed doors, not in the grease-stained alleyway of a highway diner. The man murmured something, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw, and Camille smiled, a soft, genuine smile that Kevin hadn't seen her give Ryan in over a year. Bile rose in the back of Kevin's throat. He thought of Ryan, who had skipped his own lunch breaks for a month to help Kevin rebuild the transmission on his first car. Ryan, who was currently asleep on a sagging couch, his back practically destroyed from lifting freight just to keep a roof over Camille's head. The sheer breathtaking unfairness of it hit Kevin with the force of a physical blow. His hands, thick and calloused, fumbled in the pocket of his heavy canvas jacket. He pulled out his phone. The screen cast a harsh blue glare against his face. He checked 3 times to ensure the flash and shutter sound were disabled. His hands shook slightly as he raised the lens, framing the 2 figures in the dim light. He pressed the button. Once, twice, 3 times. The digital capture was silent, but to Kevin, it felt like pulling the pin on a grenade. He lowered the phone, staring at the grainy image on the screen. The evidence was undeniable. The truth was now a tangible thing, heavy and sharp, resting in the palm of his hand. Without getting his coffee, Kevin quietly shifted the flatbed into gear and eased out of the lot, leaving the diner and its shadows behind. The drive home was suffocatingly quiet. He knew that the moment the sun came up, he was going to have to break his best friend's heart, and there was absolutely nothing he could do to stop it. Walsh Auto Repair smelled permanently of scorched rubber, stale Folgers coffee, and damp concrete. Rain drummed a relentless, heavy rhythm against the corrugated tin roof, drowning out the ambient noise of the Pennsylvania Turnpike a few miles away. Kevin stood over the disassembled carburetor of a 2012 Chevy, blindly wiping his already raw hands with a red shop rag. He had been wiping the same spot on his knuckles for 10 minutes. Sitting on the scratched metal workbench, inches away from a scattered set of wrenches, was a standard brown manila envelope. It was thin, containing only 4 freshly printed photographs from a 24-hour drugstore kiosk, but to Kevin, it seemed to warp the gravity in the room. The heavy bay door rattled as it was pushed upward, letting in a gust of damp, freezing wind. Ryan ducked under the metal track, shaking the rain from his broad shoulders. He was wearing his faded canvas work jacket over a gray hoodie, carrying a cardboard tray with 2 large coffees from a local gas station. He looked exhausted, the dark circles under his eyes bruised and heavy, but a warm, genuine smile touched his lips when he saw his friend. "Thought you might need premium fuel," Ryan said, his voice a low, steady rumble in the cavernous garage. He set the tray on a relatively clean patch of the workbench. Kevin stopped wiping his hands. He tossed the red rag onto the concrete floor. He didn't return the smile. He couldn't even look Ryan in the eye, his gaze fixing instead on the steam rising from the plastic coffee lids. "Kev, you good?" Ryan asked, the smile fading into a look of mild concern. He took a step closer, wiping a smear of grease from his own cheek with the back of his wrist. "You look like you've seen a ghost. Transmission on the Chevy, giving you hell?" "Ryan," Kevin started, his voice cracking. He swallowed hard, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. The air in the garage suddenly felt too thin to breathe. He had rehearsed a dozen different speeches in his head since he left the diner at 3 in the morning, ranging from angry tirades against Camille to gentle, brotherly condolences. Now, faced with the earnest, tired face of the man who had laid on frozen asphalt to help him fix his first tow truck, every single word evaporated. Kevin reached out, his grease-stained fingers trembling slightly, and pushed the manila envelope across the scratched metal surface of the workbench. It stopped against the base of the coffee tray. "I was on a tow late last night," Kevin said, his voice dropping to a harsh, forced whisper, "down by the diner. I didn't want to believe it, man. I'm so sorry." Ryan looked at the envelope, then back at Kevin, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out. His large, calloused fingers, bruised from years of breaking his back for a life he thought he was building, slid under the unsealed flap. He pulled out the 4 glossy prints. The first photo was slightly grainy, illuminated by the harsh security light of the alleyway. Camille's face, tilted upward. The tailored wool coat of James Smith. The desperate, familiar intimacy of the embrace. The second photo was clearer, capturing the kiss. The third showed her hand resting flat against James's chest, right where her wedding ring, the one Ryan had saved for 14 months to buy, caught the faint light. Kevin braced himself. He waited for the explosion. He waited for Ryan to scream, to hurl the hot coffee across the garage, to punch the cinder block wall until his knuckles shattered. He was ready to hold his friend back, to weather the violent storm of a broken heart. But the storm never came. Ryan stood perfectly still. The only sound in the garage was the relentless drumming of the rain on the tin roof. His breathing didn't accelerate. His hands didn't shake. The color slowly drained from his face, leaving his skin an ashen, terrifying gray. His eyes, usually warm and grounded, glazed over, retreating to a place deep inside his own head, where Kevin could not follow. The silence that radiated from him was not peaceful. It was the chilling, suffocating silence of a vacuum, of a world that had just stopped spinning entirely. He stared at the photographs for a full 2 minutes. Then, with a slow, agonizing exactness, he slid the photos back into the envelope. He set it down on the workbench, right next to his untouched coffee. "Ryan," Kevin whispered, terrified by the emptiness in his friend's eyes. Ryan didn't answer. He didn't look at Kevin. He simply turned around, zipped up his canvas jacket against the cold, and walked out into the pouring rain. The cramped, one-bedroom apartment smelled of stale laundry detergent and the faint, sweet scent of Camille's vanilla body lotion. It was an odor that usually brought Ryan Mitchell a profound sense of comfort, a reminder of the quiet sanctuary he broke his back to maintain. Today, walking through the front door, the scent made his stomach turn to lead. The silence inside was absolute. Camille had left for her double shift at the diner 2 hours ago. She wouldn't be back until well past midnight. Ryan did not tear the apartment apart. He didn't smash the framed photograph from their honeymoon in Atlantic City that sat on the television stand. He didn't hurl his steel-toed boots through the drywall. He simply walked into the bedroom, his heavy boots leaving faint, damp tracks on the cheap carpeting, and pulled a faded olive-green duffel bag from the top shelf of the closet. His movements were mechanical, stripped of any hesitation or visible grief. He packed 7 pairs of work pants, his flannel shirts, and a stack of plain white tees. He bypassed the expensive watch Camille had bought him for his 30th birthday, a gift he now suspected was funded by the extra shifts she claimed to be working, or perhaps directly by James Smith. He left it sitting untouched on the dresser. In the bathroom, he took his toothbrush and his razor, but left the shaving cream they shared. Every item he touched was a conscious calculation of necessity. If it tied him to this apartment, to this false life, to her, it stayed behind. When the duffel bag was zipped, he carried it to the living room and set it by the front door. He walked back into the small galley kitchen. The fluorescent overhead light flickered slightly, casting a sterile, pale glow over the faux granite countertops. From the inner pocket of his still damp canvas jacket, Ryan withdrew the slightly crumpled manila envelope Kevin had given him. His hands were completely steady now. The initial shock that had frozen him in the auto garage had hardened into something cold, dense, and impenetrable. There was no anger left, only a profound, hollow clarity. He opened the envelope and slid the 4 glossy photographs onto the kitchen island. He arranged them in a neat, overlapping square, ensuring that the image of Camille smiling against James's tailored coat was perfectly visible. The image of the desperate alleyway kiss. The image of her hand, and the ring he had worked overtime for months to afford, pressed flat against another man's chest. Ryan lifted his left hand. The silver band felt heavier than it had a few hours ago, as if the metal itself had thickened, turning to iron. He gripped it with his right thumb and index finger, twisting it slightly to clear the calloused knuckle. It slid off with a quiet, frictionless ease. He stared for a moment at the pale, indented ring of skin left behind. A ghost of a promise. Gently, with the precision of a man defusing a bomb, Ryan placed the silver wedding band directly in the center of the 4 photographs. It sat there, cold and heavy, catching the harsh light of the fluorescent tube above. He didn't write a note. There was nothing left to say that the photographs and the abandoned ring did not already articulate with devastating clarity. Any words he left would only be twisted, analyzed, or used by Camille to alleviate her own guilt. He refused to give her that luxury. Ryan picked up his keys, grabbed the duffel bag, and walked out of the apartment. He locked the door behind him out of sheer habit, sliding his copy of the key under the frayed welcome mat. When he started his battered sedan in the parking lot, the engine sputtered before catching, the familiar rattle vibrating through the steering column. He put the car in drive and pulled out onto the wet street. The red glow of his taillights bled into the gray Pennsylvania dusk, disappearing completely into the steady rain without making a single sound. The graveyard shift had drained the last reserves of life from Camille's body by the time she finally unlocked the door to her apartment, just after 2 in the morning. Her feet ached inside her heavy, non-slip shoes, and the pervasive, greasy smell of fried onions clung stubbornly to her hair and clothes. Usually, the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the sight of Ryan's scuffed work boots by the door would anchor her, serving as a reminder of the solid, predictable reality she returned to every night. Tonight, the space by the door was empty. "Ryan?" she called out softly, dropping her keys into the ceramic bowl on the entryway console. Her voice sounded thin, swallowed instantly by the heavy, unnatural silence of the apartment. There was no rhythmic snoring drifting from the bedroom, no television left running on low volume in the living room. The air felt stagnant, cold in a way that had nothing to do with the cheap thermostat on the wall. She walked further in, flicking on the hallway light. The bathroom door was ajar, the space inside impeccably clean, noticeably missing the usual clutter of Ryan's shaving cream and his damp blue towel. A creeping sensation of unease began to trace its way up Camille's spine, pooling at the base of her neck. She moved into the galley kitchen, reaching for the overhead switch. The fluorescent tube flickered twice, buzzing faintly before bathing the cramped room in a harsh, pale glare. She stopped dead in her tracks. On the faux granite island, arranged with a terrifying, deliberate precision, were 4 glossy photographs, and resting perfectly in the center, catching the sterile light, was a simple silver band. Camille couldn't breathe. The oxygen was suddenly sucked from the room, leaving her gasping in a vacuum. She approached the counter with slow, leaden steps, her eyes fixed entirely on the images. The Starlight Motel alleyway, the tailored wool coat, the kiss. Her own hand, adorned with that very same silver ring, pressed intimately against James's chest. "No," she whispered, the sound cracking in her dry throat. "No, no, no." Her trembling fingers reached out, bypassing the damning, glossy paper to touch the ring. It was ice cold. The metal felt impossibly heavy, entirely devoid of the warmth of the man who had worn it every single day since he placed it on her finger. Panic, sharp and blinding, clawed fiercely at her chest. She pulled her smartphone from her apron pocket, her thumbs slipping frantically against the cracked screen as she dialed Ryan's number. It rang once. Half a ring, really. Then, the automated voice of the carrier. "The subscriber you have dialed is currently unavailable. Please leave a message." She hung up and dialed again. The same dead, mechanical response. Her breathing grew ragged, echoing loudly in the silent kitchen. She opened her messaging app, typing furiously, her vision blurring. "Ryan, please. Where are you? We need to talk. I can explain everything. Please, Just answer. She hit send, but the delivery icon remained a hollow, gray circle. It wasn't just unread. It wasn't going through. Her number had been blocked. Desperation giving way to sheer terror, she opened her social media apps. She navigated to his profile, desperate for a location, a status update, any digital proof that he was still in the world. User not found. She refreshed the page with a shaking thumb. This page isn't available. The link may be broken, or the page may have been removed. Camille sank to the cold linoleum floor, her back sliding against the cheap veneer of the kitchen cabinets. She stared at the screen until the glowing light blurred with tears that she hadn't realized she was shedding. Ryan hadn't screamed. He hadn't thrown her clothes onto the lawn. He hadn't even given her the chance to beg, to lie, or to cry. He had simply looked at the truth, set down his ring, and erased himself from her universe. Sitting on the kitchen floor in her diner uniform, the silence of the apartment pressed down on her, heavier than concrete. For the first time in months, she didn't think about the thrill of James. She only thought about the terrifying, absolute emptiness of a life she had just permanently destroyed. 400 miles northeast of the crumbling Pennsylvania suburbs, the air tasted entirely different. There was no lingering scent of exhaust fumes, stale coffee, or old fry grease. Instead, the wind that whipped off the gray Atlantic Ocean was sharp, biting, and heavy with the smell of brine, wet canvas, and drying kelp. It was a cold that settled deep into the marrow, but for Ryan Mitchell, the freezing temperature was a welcome shock to the system. It meant he could still feel something other than the crushing weight in his chest. Ryan hoisted a 50-pound spool of braided nylon mooring line onto his right shoulder, his heavy work boots thudding against the weathered wooden floorboards of Miller's Marine Supply. The shop was a dimly lit, cavernous warehouse at the edge of the docks, packed to the rafters with brass fittings, rusted anchors, and reeking bait freezers. It was a place where fishermen came in at dawn, bought what they needed in gruff silence, and left. It was exactly the kind of purgatory Ryan had been driving toward when he fled into the night. He carried the heavy spool down the narrow aisle, the rough nylon digging through his flannel shirt. He set it down with a heavy thud, pulling a clipboard from a nearby hook to mark the inventory. His hands were different now. The grease and grime from the logistics warehouse back home had washed away, replaced by deep, raw splits from handling salt-soaked rope and frozen metal. But the most glaring difference was on his left hand. The pale, indented circle where his silver wedding band used to sit was slowly fading, blending back into the calloused skin. Yet, the phantom weight of it remained. Every time he gripped a steering wheel, lifted a box, or reached into his pocket, his thumb instinctively drifted to a piece of metal that was no longer there. "You're organizing the shackles wrong, kid." The raspy voice belonged to Arthur Miller, the septuagenarian owner of the shop, who was currently leaning against a stack of crab traps, nursing a styrofoam cup of black coffee. Arthur hadn't asked for a resume, a reference, or even a last name when Ryan showed up at 6 in the morning 3 days ago asking for day labor. He just tossed him a pair of heavy rubber gloves and pointed him toward the loading dock. "The galvanized ones go on the bottom shelf," Arthur continued, waving a gnarly, arthritic hand. "Salt eats right through the cheap steel if the roof leaks." "Got it," Ryan muttered, his voice hoarse from days of intentional silence. He immediately dropped to one knee on the dusty floorboards, methodically moving the heavy iron shackles one by one. The physical repetition was his only medicine. As long as his muscles burned and his back ached, his mind couldn't wander back to the fluorescent lights of the galley kitchen. He didn't have to picture the 4 glossy photographs. He didn't have to imagine Camille sitting in their empty apartment, realizing what she had broken. He had stopped at a gas station somewhere in upstate New York to drop his old smartphone into an overflowing trash can. He had paid cash for a cheap prepaid phone, giving the number to absolutely no one. There were no social media apps on it, no email accounts linked to his past. If Kevin had tried to reach him, or if Camille had left 100 desperate voicemails, Ryan would never know. He had severed the artery completely, choosing the agony of a clean amputation over the slow poison of trying to salvage the infected wound. When his shift ended at 6 o'clock, the sun was already dipping below the jagged coastline, painting the icy water in shades of bruised purple and black. Ryan walked out onto the wooden pier behind the shop, pulling the collar of his jacket up against the wind. He stood alone in the fading light, listening to the rhythmic, violent crashing of the waves against the pylons. For the first time in his life, nobody in the world knew where he was, and for the first time in days, his chest didn't feel entirely hollow. The Starlight Motel no longer felt like a secret sanctuary. Without the intoxicating adrenaline of sneaking around behind Ryan's back, Room 214 was exactly what it had always been. A cheap, $20 an hour box that smelled of stale cigarette smoke and industrial pine cleaner. Camille sat on the edge of the sagging mattress, her hands tightly clasping her phone. 4 days. It had been 4 days since Ryan vanished into the rain, leaving only his wedding ring and those 4 glossy photographs. And the silence from his end was a physical weight crushing her ribs. James stood by the foggy bathroom mirror, meticulously adjusting the knot of his silk tie. He checked his reflection, his posture perfectly composed, entirely untouched by the hurricane that had just leveled her life. "He changed his number, James," Camille said, her voice trembling in the quiet room. "His friends won't even look at me. Kevin stared right through me at the grocery store yesterday like I was a ghost. I don't know what to do." James didn't turn around. He smoothed the lapels of his expensive wool coat, his eyes focused on a microscopic speck of dust on his sleeve. "I told you, Camille, these things blow over. Blue-collar guys like that, they like to make a dramatic exit. He is probably crashing on somebody's couch, blowing off steam over a few beers. You don't know him," she whispered, the tears she had been fighting for days finally spilling over her lashes. "He didn't yell. He didn't break anything. He didn't even pack all his clothes. He just erased me. I'm entirely alone." She stood up, her legs feeling weak beneath her, and stepped toward him. She instinctively sought the warmth, the smooth, reassuring words, and the feeling of being desired that had lured her into this mess in the first place. She reached out, her fingers brushing the fine fabric of his sleeve. James stepped back. It was a small movement, just a half step toward the door, but the sudden distance between them felt like a yawning chasm. Camille's hand froze in midair. She looked at him, truly looked at him, for the first time without the blinding filter of illicit desire. The practiced warmth was entirely gone from his eyes, replaced by a cold, calculating irritation. "Look, Camille," James sighed, checking his silver wristwatch with a flick of his wrist. "I have a quarterly review meeting with corporate in an hour. This situation with your husband, it is messy, and frankly, it is a liability." "A liability?" The word sounded foreign, heavy, and metallic on her tongue. "People at the diner are starting to talk," he continued, his tone shifting effortlessly into the crisp, detached cadence he used when reprimanding staff. "If corporate gets wind of this, especially with my promotion to regional director on the table next month, it is going to be a serious problem. We need to put things on ice." "Put things on ice?" Camille's voice rose, panic clawing fiercely at her throat. "I lost my husband for you. I lost my whole life for you." James finally looked at her directly, and the absolute absence of empathy in his gaze made her blood run cold. "You didn't lose your husband for me, Camille. You lost him because you were bored. Let's not romanticize this. We had fun. But I am not looking to play house with a diner manager who comes with a public scandal attached." He reached into his tailored slacks, pulled out a crisp $50 bill, and tossed it onto the chipped veneer of the nightstand. "Pay for the room on your way out. Take a few days off shift if you need to pull yourself together." He opened the heavy door, letting in the damp, freezing Pennsylvania air, and walked out without looking back. Camille stood alone in the center of the cheap motel room, listening to the smooth purr of his BMW engine fading into the distance. She looked at the $50 bill resting next to the plastic ice bucket. The intoxicating illusion she had traded her marriage for shattered completely, leaving her with the bitter, suffocating reality that she had sold her soul and a good man's heart for absolutely nothing. The automatic doors of the local Acme supermarket slid open with a rattling sigh, letting in a gust of damp wind alongside Camille. Before the silence of the empty apartment had become too much to bear, she used to love grocery shopping. It was a mundane chore, but there had been a comforting rhythm to it. Picking out the dark roast coffee Ryan preferred, grabbing a six-pack of his favorite pale ale for the weekend, exchanging tired but warm smiles with the neighborhood regulars. Today, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead felt like spotlights in an interrogation room. Camille grabbed a cart, the front left wheel squeaking sharply against the scuffed linoleum. She kept her head down, the collar of her worn winter coat pulled up high. She didn't need much. Without Ryan's appetite, and without her own desire to cook, her list had dwindled to bread, milk, and a few frozen dinners. She turned into the dairy aisle and froze. Standing by the large glass refrigerators was Brenda Walsh, Kevin's older sister. Brenda was a nurse at the county hospital, a woman who had once spent 3 hours sitting on the floor of Camille's apartment helping her hem a dress for a diner holiday party. Camille's instinct was to offer a fragile, apologetic smile. She took a tentative step forward, her hand lifting slightly from the handle of her cart. Brenda. Brenda closed the refrigerator door. She turned, her eyes landing on Camille. There was no flash of anger, no dramatic gasp. Instead, Brenda's expression hardened into a mask of pure, unadulterated ice. She looked at Camille not as a friend who had made a terrible mistake, but as something entirely invisible. Without uttering a single syllable, Brenda pivoted on her heel, pushed her cart past Camille, and walked away, her gaze fixed rigidly straight ahead. The squeak of Brenda's cart faded down the aisle, leaving Camille standing in a vacuum of cold air spilling from the dairy case. It wasn't just Brenda. As Camille navigated the aisles, the invisible wall Kevin had built around her became suffocatingly apparent. Old Mr. Henderson, whose driveway Ryan used to shovel every winter without being asked, deliberately turned his motorized cart around when she entered the bread aisle. A group of mechanics from Walsh Auto Repair, grabbing lunch at the deli counter, fell dead silent the moment she walked past, their eyes burning holes into her back until she turned the corner. The community had reached a silent, collective verdict. Ryan Mitchell was one of their own, a man who broke his back, paid his dues, and helped his neighbors. Camille was the outsider who had destroyed him for a man in a tailored coat. By the time she reached the checkout lane, Camille's hands were shaking so violently she could barely retrieve her debit card from her wallet. The cashier was a high school girl named Chloe, whose rusted Honda Civic Ryan had kept running for free so she could get to her community college classes. Chloe didn't say hello. She didn't ask how Camille's day was going. She scanned the frozen meals in heavy, deliberate silence, her eyes firmly glued to the register screen. "Have a good day," Chloe muttered to the wall behind Camille, handing over the plastic bag. Camille took the bag, the handles digging into her trembling fingers. She walked out into the gray parking lot, the freezing wind whipping her hair across her face. As she approached her sputtering Civic, she saw Kevin's heavy flatbed tow truck idling near the gas pumps across the street. Kevin was standing by the pump, the nozzle in his hand. For a brief second, their eyes met across the expanse of cracked asphalt. Camille stopped, her breath catching in her throat, a desperate, silent plea etched across her tired face. She just wanted someone, anyone, to acknowledge that she was still a human being. Kevin held her gaze for a long, heavy moment. Then, with deliberate slowness, he turned his back to her, watching the numbers tick up on the gas pump. He didn't even care enough to be angry anymore. He was simply done. Camille got into her freezing car, locked the doors, and finally let the tears fall, realizing that the town hadn't just taken Ryan's side. They had erased her entirely. The sharp, briny wind coming off the Atlantic no longer felt like a violent shock to Ryan's system. After 3 weeks of hauling frozen bait, sorting heavy iron shackles, and sweeping salt-crusted floorboards, the coastal chill had become the steady rhythm by which he breathed. His hands, once battered by the dry cardboard and wooden pallets of the Pennsylvania Freight Depot, were now calloused by wet nylon and rusted metal. He preferred the new scars. They belonged entirely to him. "You work like a machine, Mitchell," Arthur Miller grunted, tossing a heavy canvas tarp over a stack of outboard motors near the loading dock. "And machines that don't power down eventually blow a gasket." Ryan paused, resting a heavy crate of brass fittings on his thigh. He wiped a streak of salt spray from his forehead with the back of a canvas-gloved hand. "I'm fine, Mr. Miller. Just want to finish the inventory before the storm rolls in." Arthur pulled a crumpled envelope from the chest pocket of his worn overalls and tossed it onto the crate. It landed with a soft thud. "That's your week's pay. In cash, just like you asked. Now I'm locking the dock for lunch. Go down to Main Street, get some hot food in your stomach, before you freeze to my floorboards, and I have to chisel you out." Ryan looked at the envelope, then at the old man. There were 100 questions Arthur could have asked over the past few weeks. Why a man in his early 30s with a strong back and a shadow over his eyes was working for under-the-table wages. Why he never looked at a cell phone. why he flinched at the sound of a revving engine. But Arthur never asked a single one. That unspoken respect was the first foundational stone in the wall Ryan was building between his old life and his new one. "Thanks, Arthur," Ryan said quietly, slipping the envelope into his jacket. He walked the 4 blocks to Main Street, the gray skies threatening a heavy afternoon downpour. The town was small, insulated, and entirely indifferent to the dramas of the outside world. Ryan pushed open the heavy glass door of Harbor Crust, a small bakery nestled between a closed-down antique shop and a hardware store. A brass bell chimed brightly above his head. The air inside was thick and incredibly warm, heavy with the intoxicating scent of toasted yeast, melted butter, and dark roast coffee. It was a stark contrast to the sterile, greasy smell of the highway diner that still occasionally haunted his nightmares. "Just beat the lunch rush," a voice called out from behind the glass counter. Nora, a woman in her late 20s with flour dusting the sleeves of her oversized knit sweater, offered a gentle, unassuming smile. She was wiping the espresso machine with a clean towel. Like Arthur, Nora never pried, but over the last week, she had started adding an extra shot of espresso to his dark roast without him having to ask. "Looks like it," Ryan replied, his voice still carrying the rusty cadence of disuse. "The usual?" Nora asked, reaching for a paper cup. "Black coffee, double shot, and the ham and Gruyere on sourdough?" Ryan looked at her. It was a simple question, a routine transaction, but it struck him with an unexpected force. In his old life, he had been a provider, a ghost who paid the bills while his wife looked right through him to a man in a tailored coat. Here, in a town where nobody knew his last name or the humiliation he had endured, a stranger had remembered exactly how he liked his coffee. It was a tiny, fragile thread of human connection, and for the first time in almost a month, Ryan didn't want to sever it. "Actually," Ryan said, the very faint, unfamiliar ghost of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Can you add a slice of that cherry pie too?" Nora's smile widened, genuine and bright, coming right up. 10 minutes later, Ryan sat on a wooden bench overlooking the gray, churning harbor, the hot coffee warming his raw hands. He watched a fishing trawler cut through the heavy waves, entirely focused on the horizon. He realized, with a profound, quiet sense of peace, that he hadn't thought about Pennsylvania, the photographs, or the empty space on his left ring finger for an entire day. He took a bite of the warm pie, letting the freezing ocean wind wash over him, finally breathing in the air of a world that belonged only to him. The back office of the diner was no larger than a storage closet, smelling perpetually of stale mop water and printer ink. For 4 years, it had been Camille's domain. She knew the exact angle to kick the filing cabinet to make the bottom drawer open, and she knew which ceiling tile rattled when the heavy trucks rumbled down Interstate 76. But as she walked in at 2 in the afternoon on a Tuesday, the room suddenly felt entirely foreign. James Smith sat behind her scratched metal desk. He was wearing a charcoal wool suit, perfectly tailored, his posture rigid. Sitting in the plastic folding chair next to him was a woman with severe, wire-rimmed glasses and a thick manila folder resting on her lap. "Close the door, Camille," James said. His voice was flat, devoid of any inflection. He did not meet her eyes. Camille pulled the heavy door shut, the latch clicking with a terrifying finality. She stood, gripping the strap of her purse. "What is going on, James?" "This is Diane," James said, gesturing vaguely to the woman. "She is from Regional Human Resources." Diane did not offer a handshake. She opened the manila folder, a stark, sickening reminder of the envelope Ryan had left on their kitchen island, and pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Ms. Beaumont," Diane began, her voice possessing the practiced, sterile empathy of a corporate executioner. "Corporate has been conducting a quarterly review of management performance metrics. Unfortunately, your location has seen a significant drop in efficiency over the past month. Furthermore, we have received multiple internal complaints regarding a hostile work environment and compromised staff morale." Camille felt the blood drain from her face. She looked at James, desperation clawing at her throat. "Staff morale? Nancy and the crew, they barely speak to me because of—" She stopped herself, her eyes darting to Diane, then back to James. "Because of personal rumors. You know exactly why they won't look at me, James." James finally looked up from the desk. His eyes were utterly dead. There was no trace of the man who had whispered promises in the dim light of room 214. There was only a regional director looking at a liability. Personal issues that bleed onto the diner floor become company issues, Camille, he said, his tone icy. Corporate requires management to maintain professional boundaries and team cohesion. You have failed to do so. Effective immediately, we are terminating your employment. The words hung in the small, greasy room, suffocating her. He wasn't just abandoning her, he was actively destroying her to protect his own flawless record. The promotion to regional director was weeks away, and he was cauterizing the wound she represented before the infection could spread to his career. "You're firing me," Camille whispered, the sheer audacity of the betrayal stealing her breath. "After everything I gave up for you, you're firing me to save yourself. Sign the severance acknowledgement, Ms. Beaumont," Diane interrupted smoothly, sliding a blue pen across the desk. "It includes a standard non-disclosure agreement regarding company personnel. You will receive 2 weeks' pay." Camille stared at the pen. She had no savings. Ryan had been the one to manage their modest bank account, and without his warehouse checks, the rent on the apartment was already a week overdue. She had no money for a lawyer, no energy to fight a corporate machine, and absolutely no allies left in this town to stand behind her. She was entirely outmatched. With a trembling hand, Camille picked up the pen and signed her name on the dotted line. 10 minutes later, she walked out the back door of the diner, holding a small cardboard box containing a framed photo of her mother, a spare apron, and a bottle of ibuprofen. Nancy, the line cook, was out back smoking. Nancy watched Camille carry the box to her rusted Honda Civic, took a slow drag of her cigarette, and turned away without a single word of goodbye. Camille sat in her freezing car, staring at the buzzing neon sign of the diner through the dirty windshield. She had traded a loyal, devoted husband for a tailored suit, and the tailored suit had just handed her a cardboard box. The karma was not explosive or violent. It was quiet, bureaucratic, and absolutely absolute. She rested her forehead against the steering wheel and wept into the suffocating silence of her ruined life. The apartment on Elm Street had become a tomb. It was 11 at night on a Thursday, and the only light in the living room came from the harsh, bluish glow of Camille's 5-year-old laptop. The heating unit had been sputtering all week, and without the funds to call the building manager, the air inside was practically the same temperature as the freezing Pennsylvania rain lashing against the thin window panes. She sat cross-legged on the faded carpet, wrapped in Ryan's old gray hoodie, the only piece of clothing he hadn't packed. It still smelled faintly of him, a cruel, lingering ghost of motor oil and cedar that made her chest physically ache with every breath. The cardboard box from the diner sat untouched by the front door, a monument to her spectacular ruin. Camille stared at the blinking cursor on the screen. The battery icon in the corner warned her it was at 9%. For 3 days, she had scoured the internet, paying for cheap background check sites with the last remaining dollars on her credit card. Every search had hit a dead end. Ryan's phone was disconnected. His social media was wiped. His social security number hadn't registered a new lease, a new utility bill, or a new payroll entry anywhere in the state. He had vanished with a chilling, masterful precision. But an hour ago, picking frantically through a shoebox of old tax returns in the back of the closet, she had found a crumpled W-2 form from 7 years ago, back when Ryan used to run parts for a scrapyard before he got the warehouse job. Scribbled in the top margin in his messy handwriting was an email address she hadn't seen in years, R. Mitchell, iron88@gmail.com. It was a microscopic thread, likely abandoned, but in the suffocating vacuum of her current reality, it was a lifeline. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling so violently she had to clench them into fists before she could type. What could she possibly say? "I am sorry" was a grotesque understatement. "I miss you" was an insult. She had traded a devoted man for a regional supervisor who tossed her out like garbage the moment she became a liability to his career. There was no poetry left to write, no grand defense to mount. She began to type, the clicking of the plastic keys echoing sharply in the silent room. "Ryan, I don't know if you check this anymore. I don't know where you are. I'm not writing to ask you to come back. I know I lost the right to ask for anything the night you walked out. I know Kevin told you. I know you saw the photos." She paused, a tear slipping free and landing on the spacebar with a quiet tap. She wiped her cheek with the oversized sleeve of his hoodie and kept typing. "I lost the job at the diner. James fired me to protect his promotion. The whole neighborhood knows, Ryan. Brenda, Kevin, the guys at the shop. They look at me like I'm dead, and they are right. I broke our life for an illusion, and now I have absolutely nothing left. I am begging you. Just one word. Curse at me. Tell me you hate me. Tell me you hope I rot in this apartment. I will take all of it. I just cannot survive this silence anymore. Please, Ryan, just let me know you are alive. Camille. She read the words over and over until the letters blurred together into a meaningless gray smudge. The battery indicator dropped to 7%. If she didn't send it now, she never would. She moved the cursor over the blue send button. She closed her eyes, visualizing the sturdy, quiet man who used to sleep on the sofa to rest his back, the man who had left his wedding ring directly in the center of her betrayal. She pressed down on the trackpad. A small, digital swoosh sound broke the silence. The message was gone, launched into the vast, indifferent void of the internet. Camille closed the laptop, the screen going black. She pulled her knees to her chest in the freezing, entirely dark apartment, completely alone, waiting for a ghost to speak. The Atlantic horizon was a bruised ribbon of indigo and violet, slowly giving way to the cold, pale gold of a coastal sunrise. The tide was low, the salt-heavy air carrying the sharp, clean scent of exposed kelp and wet timber. Ryan Mitchell sat on the edge of the weathered wooden dock behind Miller's Marine Supply, his legs dangling over the dark, churning water. A steaming paper cup of dark roast coffee rested between his heavy, canvas-clad boots. He had been awake since 4. Sleep came effortlessly these days, untethered from the chronic exhaustion that used to settle deep in his bones. The phantom weight on his left ring finger was completely gone, replaced by the rough, hardening calluses of a man who worked with his hands and answered only to the steady, unyielding rhythm of the ocean. Deep in the pocket of his heavy flannel coat, his phone vibrated. A single, short pulse. It was a new device, a cheap piece of plastic he had bought with cash to replace the one resting at the bottom of a highway gas station trash can. But last night, needing to retrieve an old digital tax form for Arthur to formalize his payroll, Ryan had reluctantly logged into his abandoned Gmail account. He had planned to sign out immediately, but the physical fatigue of hauling anchor chains had claimed him before he could hit the button. He pulled the phone from his pocket. The screen cast a glaring, artificial light in the pre-dawn shadow. New email. From Camille Beaumont. Ryan stared at the name. For a fraction of a second, the harsh, fluorescent lights of the Pennsylvania diner and the metallic smell of Walsh Auto Repair flickered in the periphery of his mind. He could perfectly visualize the 4 glossy photographs scattered on the faux granite island. He could almost hear the agonizing, suffocating silence of the apartment he had walked away from. The preview text was visible just below her name in a sterile gray font. I don't know if you check this anymore. I don't know where you are. I'm not writing to ask you to. The words were steeped in the unmistakable desperation of a woman who had finally hit the bottom of the abyss she had dug for herself. If he opened it, he knew exactly what he would find. Apologies crafted in the dark, pleas for a closure she felt entitled to. The heavy, toxic debris of a past that he had successfully amputated. Ryan's thumb hovered over the glowing glass. He remembered the man he used to be, the quiet, steadfast man who would have broken his own back to carry her burdens, who would have read the email a dozen times, torturing himself to find a way to absorb her pain. But that man had died the moment he set his silver wedding band down on the image of his wife kissing another man. The ocean wind picked up, sending a fine spray of icy mist across his face. It felt violently cold. It felt exactly like living. Without opening the email, without reading the rest of her plea, Ryan pressed his calloused thumb against the screen and swiped left. Delete. The message vanished, swallowed instantly by the digital void, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. Ryan didn't feel a surge of vindictive triumph. He didn't smile, and he didn't feel a lingering ache of sorrow. He simply felt a profound, quiet emptiness. The peaceful, unburdened emptiness of a slate wiped completely clean. The opposite of love, he realized, was never hate. It was absolute, unwavering indifference. He navigated to the account settings, tapped the screen twice, and permanently logged out of the email address. He slid the phone back into his coat pocket. Reaching down, he picked up his coffee, the cardboard cup radiating a steady, comforting heat against his raw palms. He took a slow sip, the dark roast bitter and grounding. Across the water, The first true sliver of the morning sun broke over the horizon, casting a blinding, brilliant path of gold across the crashing waves. Ryan Mitchell watched the light arrive, entirely alone and completely free.